a 5-alarm constitutional fire. There was a over this matter. There was a big showdown on this in court this evening. Tonight, here live, we're going to be talking with the lawyer who got the court order that should have turned around those planes this weekend. It's the same lawyer who was arguing the case in court tonight. We're going to be speaking with him live just after that court hearing in just a moment. You're going to want to see that. But before we get to that, and that is an urgent story, there's one other story that is breaking just tonight. It's just broken. It's just developed sort of within the past couple of hours. And I want to bring this to you first. I'm not sure you've seen this elsewhere. You might remember a couple of weeks ago, we covered here on this show a sort of, in the grand scheme of things, a small-scale confrontation in one small government office in Washington. It's a little agency that you definitely haven't heard of. It's called the U.S. Africa Development Foundation. And the reason we covered what was going on there is because something unusual happened there when Trump went after that office, went after that agency and tried to shut them down. At that agency, they had a physical confrontation with people from DOGE, from the Elon Musk austerity group. These would-be anonymous young men who work for Elon Musk. They showed up. Do you remember the story? They showed up at that small government agency and they demanded to be let inside. And that small government agency told them no. They said, we're an independent agency. We are actually not part of the executive branch. You have no legal authority over us. You have no legal right to come in. We do not invite you in. We say you can't come in. You cannot come in. And the DOGE kids left when they were told they couldn't come in. But then the next day they came back with muscle. They came back with people who said they were U.S. Marshals. And we think those people were possibly armed. They were carrying guns. Now, the U.S. Marshal Service consistently will not comment on this. They will not say whether or not those people were actually U.S. Marshals. We have some reporting that suggests they may not have been U.S. Marshals. Nevertheless, they reportedly claimed to be U.S. Marshals. And with those men, with those people claiming to be U.S. Marshals, the young men from DOGE did physically force their way into that agency and then locked out all the actual staff and changed the locks. So whether or not your heartstrings are pulled by the fate of that individual agency, right? You can see why this might be a qualitatively more worrying thing than some of the other stuff we have seen. I mean, there are legitimate legal disputes as to whether this DOGE group has any legal authority over some of these agencies that they're trying to get into so they can take over their systems and fire their staff and shut them down. Those disputes are legal disputes that need to be sorted out legally. You can't just use guns to force your way in the meantime, as a means of settling that dispute. If there's a legal dispute as to whether or not you are allowed in a U.S. government building, and you cast that aside and say, we've got guns, and that's the grounds on which we're coming in, what that is an armed assault on the U.S. government. That is an armed assault on a U.S. government office. That's a break-in. That's call the cops territory. That's barricade the doors territory. I mean, at that point, what's to stop the little government agency from bringing in their own armed force, right? And then we shoot it out. That said, if there is an armed part of the U.S. government, somebody who's allowed, whose agents are allowed to carry weapons, who have badges, who are allowed to use physical force as part of their job, it's the U.S. Marshals or anyone else. If they are now working for DOGE against other parts of the government that you might think have an equal claim to their services and protection, well, then if that's the case, DOGE is something different than we thought it was. Do they have an army? I mean, if the president has given his top campaign donor the ability to use physical force, the ability to use the force of arms against other parts of the U.S. government, we are in a different place than we thought we were. Worrying possibilities were raised by that conflict at the U.S. Africa Development Foundation when that unfolded a couple of weeks ago. That's why we covered it here on this show when it happened. That led last week to a lawsuit being filed against the U.S. Marshals. Democracy Forward filed this lawsuit last week, asking in part why, quote, individuals associated with DOGE have repeatedly invoked threats to engage the U.S. Marshal Service when seeking questionable access to agency buildings and information. So that happened at the U.S. Africa Development Foundation a couple of weeks ago, led to the lawsuit against the U.S. Marshals, demanding information from the Marshals last week. Well, now tonight, it has led to another physical confrontation. And this time, the agency in question actually did call the cops. In this case, it's something called the U.S. Institute of Peace. It works on things like research in conflict zones and training future diplomats. It was created by Congress during the Reagan administration. It was created in 1984. But it is not an official part of the U.S. government. It does not act in the name of the U.S. government. It is a separate institution. Nevertheless, on Friday, representatives from DOGE showed up unannounced at their building. And they showed up unannounced, this time not with somebody claiming to be a U.S. Marshal. This time they showed up with FBI agents? Wait, the FBI works for DOGE? They demanded entry into the U.S. Institute of Peace. The DOGE team was reportedly met by lawyers for the Institute who informed them, quote, of the Institute's private and independent status as a non-executive branch agency. They told them they could not come in. The DOGE representatives on Friday then departed. That was Friday. But now, today, apparently it has come to a different ending. We got this alarming quote from the CEO of that independent organization tonight. Quote, DOGE has broken into our building. The New York Times reports, quote, the U.S. Institute for Peace called the D.C. police on the Musk team members in an effort to stop them from trespassing because the Institute has control of its own building and the land it sits on. But instead, the D.C. police allowed them to enter and kicked out the Institute's officials. FBI agents, reportedly, and the local police are being used by one government agency as an armed force against another part of the government, another government agency that controls its own building and that says you can't come in. What's going on here? And how do we figure it out? Joining us now is somebody who has been trying to pry loose some of the truth of what's going on here. Skye Perryman is the president and CEO of Democracy Forward, which sued the U.S. Marshal Service last week, asking why DOGE was repeatedly invoking the Marshals while trying to force their way into various buildings in Washington. Ms. Perryman, thanks very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So we've been trying to follow this as it has been unfolding. It sort of dribs and drabs, and now this dramatic unfolding tonight. Let me just ask if there's anything that you know about this that either contradicts what I just said or can further advance the story.
Well, I think what you said is concerning, and 5 alarm, I think is what you called it, as it is what we're hearing. We're hearing concerning reports tonight from people who have been inside the Institute of Peace. And this is really, unfortunately, a pattern. It sounds unbelievable. It sounds terrifying because it is, but this is becoming a pattern. We've seen this at other agencies, including the African Development Foundation, where we also have litigation pending against its on behalf of its chair, who, by the way, is a Republican that is having to sue because the president is unlawfully removing him, and there was a confrontation. And now we have this, potentially armed confrontation today. This is not America, but this is what is happening in 2025.
The lawsuit that you've already filed concerning the Marshal Service,
Yes.
Are you seeking information from the Marshal Service as to whether or not their personnel have been seconded to DOGE somehow? Are you trying to find out under what authority whoever those people were might have been operating when they used force to get into that property?
Yes, we actually have been trying to seek that information from the government under the Freedom of Information Act, which you've talked about on your show before, that entitles all Americans to have this information. And the government has refused to provide it. And so that's why we are now again in federal court seeking to have disclosure of communications, of documents. That's one of many cases that we have pending right now to get, to really understand what's happening with DOGE, with Elon Musk, by the way, because no one voted for Elon Musk or for this, this sort of force.
I know that Democracy Forward, that your organization is involved in a lot of litigation against the president and DOGE and what they're doing